All right, if y'all thought I hated making the top 25 ranking videos every single week, wait till you get a load of this. I'm going to attempt to give you my 12 team playoff prediction. I don't know why I'm doing this. I am setting myself up for just massive trolling here. I will say this, going through and doing this is a lot harder than you would think. At least it was to me. I had to make some tough decisions on some teams because I am forecasting here, not only what I think's gonna I'm forecasting who I think's making the 12 team playoff, which means I'm forecasting what I think's going to happen this week in the regular season, next week in the regular season, rivalry weekend, and then SEC championship or conference championship weekend. And I'm telling you, it's one thing to just go, such and such ain't good enough to make the playoffs, or such and such is a lock to make the playoffs. That's one thing. And we all do that. I'm telling you, if you haven't sat down with one of these playoff calculators or simulators, you should give it a try. It might give you a newfound respect for some of the people on the playoff committee. This is not easy to do, and I'm 100% certain that I will be wrong. I'll do my best to update this every week too, because I'm drawing some obvious conclusions here by making this 12 team playoff. But here you go. Let me scoot over and see if I can get it on the screen here. But so here you go. Here's my 12 playoff teams. So I've got Oregon at the 1. So that means I expect Oregon to win the Big Ten. Now, they don't have really any hurdles remaining in the regular season, but they're likely to have to play Ohio State again in the Big Ten title game. That game will be on a neutral field. Oregon beat them by 1 at home. It would be a great game. Ohio State still has to get through Indiana, and I think they probably will. But because Ohio State's schedule is a little bit more difficult in the regular season from here on out than Oregon's is, I decided to make Oregon the 1 seed. Ohio State could clearly win the Big Ten. I'm not okay, but I've got to make, I got to make some decisions here. I've got Oregon at the 1. I've got Texas at the 2. They've got 1 loss. It's to Georgia, so it's a pretty good loss. They've got at Arkansas, which they should win that, and then they've got the final regular season game with Texas A&M. Now, here's the thing. Texas can lose that game to Texas A&M and possibly still get in the SEC championship game because there could be only one team maybe with 1 loss. That would be Texas A&M. If they beat Texas, Texas would then join a big group of teams that have 2 losses, and it'll give you a headache trying to figure out who's getting in out of that group of 2. Anyway, I'm sort of coming to the conclusion here that Texas is going to beat Texas A&M the last week of the regular season, which will not be easy. It's on the road at College Station, rivalry game. They haven't played in a long time. Texas A&M's a pretty good team, so by no means is that written in stone. Again, I'm going to change this every week, but for now, I've got Texas winning the SEC, so I've got them at the 2 seed. I had a hard time deciding between the Big 12 and the ACC in general for the 3 versus the 4 seed. I even considered for a minute Boise State or Army, and the reality is I just don't think Boise State or Army, either one, deserves a top 4 seed based on the resume that they have, even if they win the rest of their games. I don't see it compared to even the Big 12 and the ACC schedules are just much more difficult than anybody from the group of 5, where it be Army or Boise State. So what I did is I went ahead and put BYU at the 3. They're currently undefeated, and they beat SMU, who you can see I've got at the 4. So I've got SMU winning the ACC. Right now, I just don't trust Miami enough. And SMU has been on a roll. Their only loss is a 3-point loss, I think it was, to BYU earlier in the year. So I decided to give the nod to BYU, and because this is assuming they went out here, of course, and now SMU at the 4. So that's my 4 seeds, conference winners: Oregon, Texas, BYU, SMU. And then it just keeps getting harder after that. Okay. So we'll start at the 5 seed. I put Ohio State at the 5. Now they're going to have 2 losses. Some of these teams on this list may only have 1 loss, but in my scenario here, both of Ohio State's losses are to Oregon. Now, again, Oregon could definitely beat Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. Here's the deal. If Ohio State beats Oregon in the Big Ten championship game, Ohio State will be 1 and Oregon will be 5. So I've got Oregon, Ohio State 1 and 5, but those may get swapped if Ohio State beats Oregon. But even if that happens, then I think Oregon would be the 5. So either way, I think you're going to have Big Ten at 1 and Big Ten at 5. In this scenario, I've got Oregon at 1, Ohio State at 5. For the 6th seed, I went with Alabama. They've got 2 losses. They may not even play in the SEC championship game, which is why I don't have them at the 2 seed. It's possible if Alabama gets into the SEC championship game that they could beat a Texas or whoever it is that's in there. I think Alabama is a team that if they play up to their potential, they could beat almost anybody. Maybe. They look really good when they play well. So this isn't necessarily me thinking that Texas is better than Bama. It's just the records and where we're at right now. It seems like Texas is more likely to make the SEC championship game maybe than a Bama because Bama's got the 2 losses. But again, Bama looks really good. I've got them at 6. At the 7 seed, I've got Ole Miss. They've got 2 losses. One is inexcusable, the Kentucky loss. There's no reason for them losing that game. But a lot of teams have a head scratching. Bama lost to Vandy. How do you justify that? You can't. But Bama's still a pretty good team. Same with Ole Miss. And the LSU loss was strange in that Ole Miss never trailed in that game, not for 1 second. LSU literally won the game on the last play of overtime. Now, credit to LSU for that. It's a huge win, but it's not like Ole Miss went out and got blown out or got dominated, or they kind of controlled the game. So I think Ole Miss is an example. Bama may be an example of this too, are teams that are playing their best football now at the end of the year, which is what you want to be doing heading into the playoffs. So I've got Ole Miss at 7. At 8, I've got Penn State. They just don't have anything in their way from here to the end of the regular season. So it looks like Penn State's going to go 11-1. Their only loss will have been to Ohio State, a 7-point loss at home a couple of weeks ago. And Ohio State, in my simulation here, only has 2 losses, and they're both to Oregon. So now Penn State doesn't have any great wins. I mean, they had to go to overtime to beat, was it Southern Cal? So they don't have any great wins. I will grant you that. I don't think they're a great team, but they're in what most people would consider to be either the best or second best conference, the Big Ten. And I've got them finishing 11-1 in this scenario here. And I just don't see any way they would get left out. Because of that, I had to put Indiana in too, which we'll get to in a minute. So at number 9, I've got Georgia. This is obviously assuming that Georgia beats Tennessee this weekend. If Georgia doesn't beat Tennessee, they'll be out and Tennessee will be in their place. So I know, some people are going to say this is ridiculous. There's no way Georgia's beating Tennessee. Maybe. I mean, I don't know. Georgia's a 9-point favorite. So I'm just going with the favorite there. That's all I'm doing. It's at home for Georgia. It's a night game, back against the wall, must-win game, and they're favored by 9. It's not ridiculous for the purposes of this scenario to think that Georgia could win that game. The problem for Tennessee is, and you can see they're not in here, same record as Georgia, a win over Bama, and that's great, but that loss to Arkansas, I think, is going to hurt Tennessee and potentially keep them out of the 12-team playoff, even at 10-2. But I've got Georgia at 9. At the 10 spot, I've got Notre Dame. Here's my deal with Notre Dame. Now, I'm not necessarily trying to predict here what the playoff committee would do. I think the playoff committee would have Notre Dame. If Notre Dame's 11-1, I think the playoff committee is going to put Notre Dame somewhere 5-8 to give them a home playoff game. I'm not giving Notre Dame a home playoff game. I'm just not doing it. They're not in a conference. They only play 12 games. They avoid a potential loss by not being in a conference and therefore not having to play a conference championship game. And they have the absolute worst loss of any of these playoff teams, period. A home loss to Northern Illinois where they were a 30-something point favorite. It's just by far the worst loss of any playoff team on here. But because they're 11-1 in my scenario, because Army is undefeated and ranked and Notre Dame gets to play them in a couple of weeks, I feel like they are going to get into the 12-team playoff. I refuse to reward them with a home playoff game. I'm not doing it. The playoff committee probably will, but I've got them at 10. At number 11, I've got Indiana. And this was the hardest one for me, 11. I considered Indiana. I considered Tennessee. I considered Miami, who in this scenario I have losing the ACC championship game to SMU, which would put Miami at 11-2. I considered Clemson at 10-2. I considered the loser of the Big 12 title game were it to be Colorado. I considered a lot of different possibilities for the 11 seed here. To me, it comes back to the perception out there that the Big 10 and the SEC are the two best conferences, and you're going to have an Indiana team here who is 11-1 in the Big 10. Now, they're not going to have any massive win. Their best win right now is probably Illinois. Did they play Illinois? Anyway, a lot of this with Indiana, I think, is going to depend on, well, obviously it's going to depend on the Ohio State game coming up in a couple of weeks between Indiana and Ohio State. Right now, I've got Ohio State beating Indiana at 11-1. If Indiana loses that game by 4 touchdowns, maybe they don't get in. You know, if they lose 45-10 to Ohio State, it's possible Indiana does not get in at that 11 spot. That would open up an additional spot for Tennessee at 10-2, or Miami at 11-2, or blah, blah, on down the whatever team you might want to fill in there. So if you're a bubble team, Georgia's a bubble team. I would consider Georgia to be a bubble team, Indiana to be a bubble team, Penn State to be a bubble team, Tennessee, Miami, runner-up in the Big 12. I would consider all of those bubble teams. If you're a bubble team, you probably want Indiana to get blown out by Ohio State because that may remove them from the playoff equation. I'm not convinced they will get blown out by Ohio State. In fact, I think it's possible they could win the game. It's in Ohio State, so Ohio State will be favored, and I'll probably pick Ohio State to win. But I've been impressed with what I've seen from Indiana this year when you watch the games, admitting that they haven't exactly played a juggernaut of a schedule up to this point. But if they're 11-1, it's going to be hard to keep them out. I've got them at 11, and that leaves the 12 spot for the Group of 5 team, which I have here as Boise State. Now, this is assuming, obviously, that Boise State runs the table and wins their conference championship game. Army may do that too with a loss to Notre Dame. I just think Boise State would get the nod in that final ranking over Army. I could be wrong. It could be Army in that spot. Who knows? It could end up being Tulane. But I've got Boise State for now on the 12 spot. I considered whether or not I should have Boise State higher than that. And it just keeps coming back to me to strength of schedule. Now, they played Oregon tough, no question. They had a 3 or 7 point loss, 10 point, whatever it was. It was a close game to Oregon. They played them tough, no doubt about it. But they just don't have they don't have a single win that impresses anybody in terms of the opponent they played. Now, you can say, well, they went out and blew out this team or blew out that team. And the same thing goes for Army. The same thing goes for Tulane. They just don't have the week in and week out grind that you have in the Power 4 conferences. Again, even if you want to say the ACC and the Big 12 aren't great, it is much more difficult to get through the ACC or the Big 12 than it is for Boise State or Army to get through their conferences. That's just a fact. So I've got them in, but I've got them at 12. So I'm going to attempt now to play this thing down for you. And I did this earlier. So in the first round games, I've got Boise State versus Ohio State, and obviously I've got Ohio State winning that one. Ohio State. Georgia versus Penn State. This is an interesting game here because these are two pretty good defenses and two abysmal offenses. this would be a low-scoring game. Kirby Smart has a lot of wins in big games. James Franklin seems to not have any. So for that reason, I'm going to go with the Dogs to get it done in the first round. They beat Penn State. Indiana and Alabama, I think this would be a mismatch of epic proportions here. I think Alabama would run away with it. I think Alabama would beat Indiana in this scenario. Notre Dame and Ole Miss. Notre Dame stays on the we're back list by losing in the first round of the playoffs to Ole Miss in this scenario. On to the quarterfinals. Now, remember, all these were home games. So Ohio State, home game against Boise. Penn State, home game against Georgia. Georgia would have to travel up to Happy Valley. Indiana would have to go on the road to Bama, and Notre Dame would have to travel to Oxford. So there we go. On to the quarterfinals, which are neutral site games. These are bowl sites, traditional New Year's Six sites. I've got Ohio State versus SMU. I think the Cinderella season for SMU ends there. I like Ohio State to win that one. And I don't know why it automatically filled in Oregon, but I would have picked Oregon. I would have picked Oregon here to beat Georgia. So I would have Ohio State over SMU, Oregon over Georgia. So Ohio State and Oregon are first two Final Four teams. Alabama versus BYU. Again, I can't see Alabama losing to BYU or BYU having the athletes or the horses to compete here. I would take Bama there. Ole Miss versus Texas. This would be an interesting game. Now, this is two SEC teams, but they didn't play in the regular season. And this is a tough one to me. I'm going to go with Ole Miss in this one. I haven't seen Texas play Texas A&M yet. Now, in this scenario, I've got Texas beating A&M in the regular season, thus earning the 2 seed here in the playoffs. But the reality is Texas just doesn't have any great wins. They beat a terrible Michigan team. They've beat Mississippi State and Florida in the SEC, which are just horrendous. They beat Oklahoma, who was really bad. The best team they've played is Georgia. They lost at home by 2 touchdowns. I went with Ole Miss over Texas in this one. Now, again, maybe Texas is peaking at the right time. They just destroyed Florida. We'll see how they look this week on the road against Arkansas. They've got the Texas A&M game coming up at the end, and maybe they can change my mind. But right now, where we're at now, I would have to go with Ole Miss in that scenario against Texas. And this is just the way the seeding worked out. It ended up with the Big Ten on one side and the SEC on the other. Now, if a couple of these seedings get flip-flopped in round one, then you, of course, could have ended up with Ohio State versus Bama in the semis and Oregon versus Ole Miss or whatever. But this is just how it ended up the way I seeded the teams here. We get the Big Ten on one side and the SEC on the other. So Ohio State versus Oregon. And you have to ask yourself, can Oregon beat Ohio State 3 times in the same season? Answer no. I think Ohio State beats them in this scenario. Alabama versus Ole Miss. This is a tough one too. This is a really tough one here. I went with who I just think is the more talented team, and that's Bama. My national championship game right now this week, Ohio State, a 5 seed versus Bama, a 6 seed. Interestingly, neither of those teams conference winners, at least in the scenario that I've got laid out this week. All right, I can't wait to get trolled on this. This will be amazing. This will be unbelievable. I can't wait. But anyway, let me know what you think down below. And should I do this every Monday, do my top 25 in the morning and do this in the afternoon? Or should I just forget about this altogether because y'all are going to troll me into oblivion? Let me know down below. Appreciate you watching. Have a good morning.